I'm Ben McGorm, and this is The Wild Harvest. There's a sentence most of us recognise before it's even finished. We hear the opening words and instinctively brace ourselves. Not because we don't understand them, but because we think we already know where they're going to lead. If you eat meat. Usually, that's where we stop listening. We assume judgment is coming, or politics, or an argument we didn't ask to be a part of. So we prepare our response before the sentence has even had time to land. We decide whether we agree or disagree, or want to exit the conversation altogether. And I want to slow that moment down. Not to finish the sentence for you, and not to steer it toward a conclusion, but to stay with it long enough that it stops feeling like a setup. Because at its core, that opening isn't an accusation. It isn't a trap. It's just a statement of participation. Most people eat meat. I do. And everything that follows in this episode begins from that shared position. Not from a place of moral authority or distance, but from the simple fact that we are already involved. Once you acknowledge that honestly, something else becomes unavoidable. Eating meat means an animal died. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally. A living thing stopped living so that we could eat. That sentence feels heavy, not because it's extreme, but because it's ordinary. Ordinary enough that most of us have built our lives in ways that allow us not to think about it very often. We can buy food wrapped in plastic, walk it to a register, and leave without ever having to confront what came before that moment. No sound, no struggle, no personal sense of responsibility. Just a product. For most of my life, that distance felt normal. Not good or bad, just normal. I didn't avoid thinking about it because I didn't care. I avoided thinking about it because I didn't have to. The system was designed to carry that weight for me, and I accepted the convenience of that without really examining what it meant. It was only much later, during my agricultural science studies at university, that I began to see how much effort goes into maintaining that distance. How many steps exist between a living animal and a meal? And how many people are involved? How many processes are designed to make sure we don't see too much, know too much, or feel too much? There was also the quiet realization that understanding food systems at scale doesn't automatically mean carrying the weight of killing at an individual level. This episode isn't about tearing those systems down. It's about asking a quieter question, one that sits underneath all of them. What does it mean to participate in something you've chosen not to look at? Because whether we hunt, or buy, or outsource entirely, participation is already happening. The animal is already dead. So the question isn't whether harm exists. The question is how honestly we're willing to relate to it. That's where this conversation begins. Not with answers, not with solutions, just with the willingness to stay present long enough to let the sentence finish itself. Distance doesn't happen by accident. It's built deliberately, layer by layer, until it becomes the most normal part of the experience. When we talk about modern food systems, we usually talk about efficiency, scale, safety, consistency. All of those matter, and I don't want to pretend that they don't. They feed a lot of people, and they do it reliably. But there's another outcome those systems produce just as effectively, even if it's rarely named. They produce distance. Distance from the animal itself. Distance from the process. Distance from the moment where life becomes food. By the time meat reaches us, almost everything that might ask something of us emotionally has been removed. The blood, the sound, the smell, the decision. Even the sense that a decision was ever made. What's left is something tidy and manageable, something that fits easily into a trolley or a fridge without demanding much reflection at all. And that distance isn't neutral. It changes how responsibility is felt. When harm is abstract, responsibility becomes abstract too. It's easy to believe that because we didn't personally take a life, we aren't really involved in the act itself. The work has been outsourced. The weight has been distributed across systems and processes, and people we'll never meet. And because no single moment belongs to us, no single responsibility ever quite lands. For a long time, that felt like progress. Felt like civilization doing what it's meant to do, protecting people from having to deal with difficult things directly. And in many contexts, that protection is genuinely necessary. We can't all be responsible for everything all the time. But food is different. Food enters our bodies. It becomes a part of us. And when that food comes from an animal, the decision to eat it carries a moral dimension, whether we acknowledge it or not. Distance doesn't remove that dimension, it just makes it easier not to feel it. What I began to notice once I started paying attention was how carefully that distance is maintained. How rarely we're invited to think about where meat comes from beyond broad, comforting categories. How often language is used to soften reality. Cuts instead of bodies, products instead of animals, processing instead of killing. None of that's malicious. It's just functional. It keeps the system moving. But it also keeps us from having to ask whether we're comfortable with what's happening on our behalf. That question doesn't require a single correct answer. People will land in different places depending on their values, their circumstances, and their capacity to engage. What matters more is whether the question is even allowed to exist. Distance discourages that. It tells us that if something is unpleasant to think about, it's probably not our responsibility to think about it at all. That if harm is indirect, it's somehow less real. And that as long as the system is legal, regulated, and efficient, our role ends at consumption. I lived comfortably inside that framework for years. I didn't interrogate it because it worked, and because interrogating it felt unnecessary. It wasn't until I started closing that distance, slowly, imperfectly, that I realized how much of my certainty had been built on not having to look too closely. That's not an indictment, it's an observation. Distance makes participation feel passive, even when it isn't. It allows us to eat meat without ever confronting the fact that our choices are supported by acts we might struggle to perform ourselves. And that gap between what we consume and what we could personally carry is where ethical discomfort tends to surface if we let it. Once you see that clearly, it becomes harder to pretend that not thinking about it is a neutral position. There's a word that tends to stop conversations like this in their tracks, even when it's the most accurate one available. Killing. We reach for softer language almost instinctively. Harvest, take, process. And those words have their place. They describe parts of the sequence honestly. But they can also create just enough distance to make the central act feel abstract again. And at some point, abstraction stops being helpful. When an animal dies so that we can eat, that animal is killed. That doesn't make the act cruel by default, but it does make it serious. Violence is a part of that reality, whether we like the word or not. Not violence as spectacle, and not violence as chaos, but violence as irreversible force applied to a living body. Pretending otherwise doesn't make the act more ethical. It just makes us less present with what's actually happening. This is where I think a lot of conversations collapse. Because once violence is acknowledged, people assume justification must follow. Defense. Explanation. A line of reasoning designed to make the discomfort go away. I'm not interested in doing that here. I don't think killing an animal for food needs to be justified as long as it's carried with full responsibility. Responsibility, in this context, isn't a feeling, it's behaviour. It shows up long before the moment itself, in how much effort you put into ensuring the animal doesn't suffer unnecessarily, in how seriously you take your own limitations, in your willingness to walk away when conditions aren't right, even if the opportunity is there, in whether you're prepared to live with the decision afterwards, quietly, without needing it to be validated. Presence matters because absence is what allows carelessness to creep in. Distance makes violence easier. Presence makes it heavier. And that weight isn't something to be avoided. It's something to be carried. If the act feels trivial or exciting or inconsequential, something has gone wrong long before the trigger was pulled. And I'm not saying that hunting can't be exciting. I'm just saying the weight of that decision must be carried with the weight it deserves. For me, being present with killing hasn't dulled anything. It's sharpened it. It's made me slower, more deliberate, less willing to rush towards outcomes. It's made restraint feel like part of the ethical act itself, not a failure to complete it. I don't believe ethics begin after the animal is dead, and I don't believe that they end there either. Killing is a moment inside a much longer sequence of responsibility. Treating it as the whole story, either to condemn it or to glorify it, misses what actually matters. What matters is whether you're willing to be fully present for the act you benefit from. Whether you're willing to acknowledge the violence without outsourcing it emotionally. Whether you can sit with the discomfort long enough that it shapes your behaviour, rather than being something you try to erase. That's where I stand on this. Not because I enjoy it, not because I'm indifferent to it, but because refusing to look directly at violence doesn't make us more ethical. It just makes us less honest about the system we participate in. Once you accept participation, and once you stay present with what that participation actually involves, a few things become harder to avoid. One of them is limits. There are limits to what we can outsource ethically, limits to how far distance can protect us from responsibility, and limits to how much comfort we should expect when our choices are supported by irreversible acts, whether we perform them ourselves or not. Modern life is very good at offering clean exits. It gives us ways to participate without attending, to benefit without carrying, to consume without staying present long enough for anything to change us. And in most areas of life, that efficiency is a gift. But when it comes to food, and especially when it comes to meat, those exits come at a cost. Attention is what closes that gap. Not constant attention, and not performative attention, but honest, occasional willingness to look directly at what's happening on our behalf. To acknowledge that an animal died, that a decision was made, that suffering was involved, even if it was minimized carefully and responsibly. Attention doesn't demand purity. It demands honesty. Responsibility grows out of that attention, but it doesn't point in a single direction. It doesn't tell everyone to hunt. It doesn't tell everyone to stop eating meat. And it doesn't offer a universal rule that resolves the discomfort cleanly. What it does offer is constraint. Constraint on how casually we talk about food. Constraint on how easily we excuse ourselves from the process. Constraint on how quickly we judge others without interrogating our own participation first. For me, hunting has been one way of accepting that constraint directly. It's not the only way, and I don't pretend that it is, but it's forced me to stay present with the full sequence, from decision to act to aftermath, in a way that buying meat never did. And once you've done that, it's very difficult to go back to thinking about food as something neutral or abstract. That doesn't make hunting morally superior. It makes it exposed. Exposure has consequences. It narrows your margin for self-deception. It sharpens your sense of responsibility. And it makes it harder to tolerate carelessness, whether in yourself or in the systems you rely on. This episode isn't here to tell you what to do with that. It's here to suggest that avoiding the question altogether isn't a neutral position. That comfort, while understandable, is still a choice. And that responsibility doesn't disappear just because it's inconvenient to sit with. If you eat meat, you're already a part of this story. The only question left is how honestly you're willing to relate to that fact, how much attention you're prepared to give it, and where you choose to draw your own limits once you do. I don't have a solution to offer, and I'm not interested in pretending there is one. What I do believe is that ethics live in attention, not slogans, in restraint, not performance, and in the willingness to let discomfort shape behavior rather than rushing to make it go away. That's as far as I want to take it here. Not to resolve anything, just to leave the weight where it belongs. I'm Ben McGorm, and this is The Wild Harvest.